As I turn to some reflections this evening, I'd like to begin by sharing a thought experiment described by Eric Schwitzgebel, professor of philosophy at University of California, Riverside, in a 2015 article in Aeon magazine entitled, "How Often Do Ethics Professors Call Their Mothers?" He writes, an ethics professor teaches ethical arguments for vegetarianism to her undergrads. And in her view, presenting the different ethical perspectives, it's morally wrong to eat meat. Class ends, and she goes to the cafeteria for a cheeseburger. A student approaches her and expresses surprise at her eating meat. "Why are you surprised?" asks our ethicist. "Yes, it is morally wrong for me to enjoy this delicious cheeseburger. However, I don't aspire to be a saint. I aspire only to be about as morally good as others around me. Look at this cafeteria. Almost everyone else is eating meat. Why should I sacrifice this pleasure, wrong though it is, while others do not? Indeed, it would be unfair to hold me to higher standards just because I'm an ethicist. I'm paid to teach, research, and write like every other professor. I am paid to apply my scholarly talent to evaluating intellectual arguments about the good and the bad, the right and the wrong. If you want me also to live as a role model, you ought to pay me extra." Furthermore, she continues, if we demand that ethicists live according to the norms that they espouse, that will put major distortive pressures on the field. An ethicist who feels obligated to live as she teaches will be motivated to avoid highly self-sacrificial conclusions, such as that the wealthy should give most of their money to charity or that we should eat only a restricted subset of foods. Disconnecting professional ethicists' academic inquiries from their personal choices allows them to consider the arguments in a more even-handed way. If no one expects us to act in accord with our scholarly opinions, we are more likely to arrive at the moral truth. "In that case," replies the student, "is it morally okay for me to order a cheeseburger too? Weren't you listening? No, it would be wrong. It's wrong for me also, just as I admitted. I recommend the avocado and the sprouts." Schwitzgebel reflects further on these cheeseburger ethics. He says, any of us could easily become much morally better than we are if we chose to. For those of us who are affluent by global standards, the path is straightforward. Spend less on luxuries and give the savings to a good cause. And even if you're not affluent by global standards, unless you are on the precipice of ruin, you could give more of your time to helping others. It's not difficult to see multiple ways every day in which one could be kinder to those who would especially benefit from kindness. And yet, most of us choose moral mediocrity instead. It's not that we try but fail, or that we have good excuses. Most of us, actually aim at mediocrity. The cheeseburger ethicist is perhaps only unusually honest with herself about this. We aspire to be about as morally good as our peers. If others cheat and get away with it, we want to do the same. We don't want to suffer for goodness, while others laughingly gather the benefits of vice. If the morally good life is uncomfortable and unpleasant, if it involves repeated painful sacrifices that are not compensated in some way, sacrifices that others are not making, then we don't really want to do it. Now, while this description of how morality appears to work in practice may seem a rather depressing way to kick off Rosh Hashanah and the High Holy Day season, you have to admit it is refreshingly honest. Schwitzgebel, elsewhere in his article, mentions asking clergy whether they think they behave more or less morally than anyone else, and the answers that he received were about the same, or sometimes maybe a little worse. So please don't misunderstand this as a moralizing sermon aimed at the layperson. I'm in this just as much as you. What Schwitzgebel goes on to share with reference to the research of other ethicists is that people tend more often to comply with moral norms when they observe others around them doing likewise, and they are more likely to violate those norms when they observe that others appear to be too. And somewhat in conflict with our teaching from Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, a line that has become a lyric of a popular Jewish summer camp song, mitzvah goreret mitzvah. Woo. Doing one mitzvah will lead to doing more mitzvot. Researchers find many examples of people applying moral self-licensing, where behaving well on one occasion becomes the excuse for behaving less well on another occasion, as though banking a few mitzvah points simply gives us credit against which we can borrow. So if we find ourselves nodding and recognizing the hard truths being shared by this research, perhaps one question is, well, so what leads to shifts in norms? If each of us, flawed, weak-willed, aiming to be so-so on the ethical and moral living scale, not too selfish and not too self-sacrificing, tend to take our cues on how to calibrate how we are doing by those around us, then we ought to be concerned when those in positions of power and leadership, those who get a platform to communicate widely via TV and blogs and Twitter, appear to be shifting the norms of moral acceptability. For those who are parents, we care deeply what example the teacher of our child sets by how they speak and how they respond if they hear or see ethically problematic behavior among students in the class. To be more concrete, when a swastika or a Pepe the Frog image, which is a cartoon image that's been claimed by the alt-right and white supremacists, is found scrawled in the school bathrooms, it matters that the head of school or superintendent communicate their deep disappointment and the unacceptability of behavior that makes other kids feel less safe. To be silent allows those who are lowering the ethical standards to begin to redefine the norms. And I must say, in the town of Westborough and several other local towns in which I've had dealings with school leadership in the past year or so, the response has been exactly what we needed from them. But occasionally in some of the towns it's been less than ideal. And that then leads to what comes next. Often at this time of year, we speak of the inner work that each of us can do individually, the process of teshuvah, more traditionally translated as repentance. It literally means return, and I like to define it as a returning to our highest sense of self. And indeed, this is important spiritual work for us all to do, to take stock of where we are in our lives, recognize the ways in which we so often miss the mark, encourage ourselves to try and do better in the year to come, and to reach out to fix broken or strained relationships. There's a famous teaching that I learned in a Jewish context, attributed to Rabbi Israel Salanta, the founder of Musar, the Jewish ethical mindfulness movement. I'm not entirely sure of its provenance, but regardless, the teaching has a lot to offer. When I was a young man, I wanted to change the world, but I found it was difficult to change the world, so I tried to change my country. When I found I couldn't change my country, I began to focus on my town. However, I discovered I couldn't change the town, and so as I grew older, I tried to change my family. Now, as an old man, I realize the only thing I can change is myself. But I've also come to recognize that if long ago I had started with myself, then I could have made an impact on my family. And my family and I could have made an impact on the town. That in turn could have changed the country. And we could all indeed have changed the world. This is wisdom that we turn to, especially at this time of year, in recognition that you can't force others to change. We only truly have agency over our own choices and behaviors. And I still believe that in a great many instances that this is a truth that can guide us. However, in light of Schwitzgebel's research that he presents in his paper, I also see that, as with so many things that we learn, that teaching from Salanta is only a partial truth. It isn't always the way forward in every situation. When we observe that the norms in our broader society appear to be changing, and influential voices or groups are bringing things that many of us thought were basic values of decency and honesty and kindness and ethical speech under attack, I think that these are times where we do need to begin at the broader level. We do that by demanding better of our leadership. If we hear about or observe ugly behaviors or hateful speech in our schools, at our social gatherings, in the media, on the internet, and in our public squares, we must respond. When there are rallies called to bring people together to say, this is not who we are, this is not who we want to be, we cannot just watch from the sidelines. We have to show up. We cannot afford to be too busy to call or email our representatives. A letter to the local paper or a meeting with the school teacher or the principal does make a difference. We cannot only object within the echo chambers of our Facebook feeds. We have to bring our voices, our values, our ethical and moral higher selves into the public space, lest our abdicating this responsibility leaves those spaces wide open to be filled with more Charlottesvilles. And we simply cannot stay home and let that happen. Returning to the research of Schwitzgebel, in his article, he struggles out loud with what his findings mean for him personally, as he grapples with how hard he is willing to work to counter what the research seems to indicate, that we judge our own morality relative to social norms and only expect a B or a B+ from ourselves. In conclusion, he states, "It seems a waste not to try to use my ethical knowledge to make myself a little ethically better than I currently am. Part of what I find unnerving about the Cheeseburger ethicist is that she seems so comfortable with her mediocrity, so uninterested in deploying her philosophical tools toward self-improvement. Presumably, if approached in the right way, the great traditions of moral philosophy have the potential to help us become morally better people. But in Cheeseburger ethics, that potential is cast aside. So in between the work we do individually to try and better ourselves and the work we must do to hold the line on acceptable moral and ethical norms in our broader society, is another place that can help us to navigate our path, our faith community. We have centuries of ethical discourse available to us, not simply dictating what we should do, but giving us a place to enter the conversation and engage together in an intentional spiritual community in ethical self-reflection and moral action. There are many ways that we make this available at Congregation B'nai Shalom. Our spiritual journey group reflects on the work of refining our character traits. Those who come every single week to Saturday morning Torah study, where these philosophical and ethical debates are the core of our conversation. Those who drive our social action agenda, and those who sign up for opportunities to volunteer and act in our local community. Those who come to the special programs we offer to explore these ideas and discuss them together, like scientists in synagogues, or brotherhood breakfasts, or sisterhood kalot. The synagogue can be a central locus of respectful and engaged debate and reflection on what it actually means to live a moral and ethical life in this day, drawing inspiration from centuries of Jewish philosophical teachings. It can be the community within the larger community where we experiment with what it means to try and be our higher selves, giving a little bit more of ourselves to be part of something greater than ourselves, in order to make a difference in our towns and in our nation. The The times we live in are too urgent to leave this for another year or another time in our lives when we feel less pressured or less busy. I urge us all to renew and refresh ourselves this Jewish New Year of 5778, to engaging in the public square, to demand that we live according to our highest ethics, and to continue to do the inner personal work that we return to year after year to find that highest potential within ourselves. And let Congregation B'nai Shalom, your spiritual home, be a venue and a community that you utilize as often as you can so that we can pursue these goals together. It may be true that many of us in this room are in fact cheeseburger eaters, but let's not be cheeseburger ethicists. Shana Tova. We're going to continue now with the Festival Kiddush, and you can find the words on page